Thank you very much, and thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak a second time. It's really a pleasure. How are we doing for time? 15 minutes? Okay, good. So this is gonna be sweet and short, I hope. And well, my presentation is entitled Problems in the Tendering Process, but really I would like to give you a positive message and tell you as suppliers that really, if there is any problems, the message that I'm going to convey is a good one, because really the GPA gives you the opportunity to address problems and to enforce your rights under the GPA, and this is what it's all about, really. So let's not focus too much on the problems, let's focus on the positive aspects of what we call in GPA terminology domestic review. And we've heard about bid challenges, domestic reviews in several of the presentations. I was particularly impressed with the Georgian example, where Georgia said we actually like this figure of bid complaints going up in our system because we take it as a sign of trust of the private sector in our review mechanism. And why does a public authority, why does the state have an interest in the private sector actually launching these bid complaints? It's because it helps the state and the public sector to address problems in the procurement system and to actually identify what needs to be improved in the procurement methods, for example. So this is something that's also embodied in the GPA, this idea that an independent and speedy review of procurement decisions is actually something that's positive and that can help the state monitor the system. So you as a private sector all of a sudden are in the role of someone, so to say, giving feedback on whether the procurement system works well or not and whether you're facing problems or not. So it really helps the public sector ensure systemic integrity. And in the WTO, there's another layer to this. In the WTO, you may know that there's what we call the dispute settlement understanding, which allows another state to complain about the policies of another WTO member. So, for example, Canada could complain against Japanese legislation. They would never do this, of course, because everybody likes everybody in the GPA committee, but there's this option. So this option also exists for the GPA, and what we see in the GPA committee is actually, if we compare the GPA to other WTO agreements, we have a very low number of disputes being launched in the area of government procurement. And sometimes we're being asked, why is that? Don't GPA parties trust in your WTO dispute settlement system? And we say no. In the GPA context, this is not because parties don't trust the WTO dispute settlement body. This is because the GPA actually gives a much better tool to the private sector to enforce their rights under the GPA. The GPA says that each and every GPA member needs to have this kind of domestic review of procurement decisions in the system in the country. So the private sector companies, if they feel that their rights under the GPA have not been fully respected, have this means of redress, and this is actually more effective and quicker and more efficient than going to your government, telling them you now need to complain against another state and launching that whole system. So this is why we think the GPA is really one of the most effective WTO agreements, because it has this double enforcement standard. And only the really big political issues get addressed in the WTO dispute settlement. So what does the GPA say about the domestic review system, where the private sector can directly complain against acts of the the procuring entities? What does the GPA say about this? The GPA says that each GPA party needs to put in place a domestic review system that is timely, effective, transparent, and non-discriminatory. And this may be boring to you because it's exactly the same principles that also apply to the procurement system as a whole. And this applies also to the domestic review system. It says a bit more, but I'm just going to give you an overview of what the GPA envisages in terms of domestic review. And again, what I said in my first presentation is true here. The GPA only sets minimum standards. It only gives certain key elements that the domestic review system needs to have, and then it's up to each GPA party to actually implement it in the way that fits the legal system in the country. So the first thing that the GPA says is that parties shall encourage consultations between the private entity, the supplier, and the contracting authority. But this is something that is just encouraged, it's not mandatory. So you can also have something that I would call internal review, so the supplier directly contacting the procuring entity. But we heard from Georgia, for example, that some people think this is not very effective because you would always assume that the procuring entity is biased in its decision, and this kind of review can only correct unintentional errors. Maybe it can correct some errors where a true mistake was made and the procuring entity just says, oh, sorry, we had a problem here, we're going to correct this immediately. So you need another layer, and this is where the domestic review system really comes into play. And here the GPA says that you need to have an impartial, independent, administrative or judicial authority. And if it's an administrative authority, then there may be a right to appeal to a judicial authority, for example. And so here again, GPA only sets minimum standards. It provides choice to actually adapt this domestic review system to the legal system in place. And in the presentations of the different GPA parties, you've already seen that different GPA parties have different systems in place. You have the US, where the GAO is an administrative body, but they also provide means of addressing procurement decisions in the judicial authorities. In the US system, the GAO, the administrative authority, is used very widely and has a lot of trust, so they made good experiences with this. Canada and Japan, for example, are countries that have more of an arbitration type system in place specifically to address violations of the GPA. So that's a different approach to how they comply with the domestic review requirements. And here you see also that the GPA really gives a choice between enforcing the GPA's rules directly or enforcing the legal, the laws of the country that implement the GPA. So again, choice here. And it needs to be effective, so there need to be rapid interim measures that may result in the suspension of the procurement process, and corrective action or compensation must be offered. So this is what's important to you, especially the rapid interim measures. The GPA ensures that something needs to be able to be done in order to preserve your rights to participate in the procurement process. So suspension here is something that's most often the most effective means of preserving your rights, because once a contract is signed and once the contract is implemented, you will have a very hard time in enforcing your rights because the facts are already created. So this is why the GPA says very clearly there need to be these effective measures to actually preserve your rights during the process. So this is really just repeating what I've already said. So there's a choice between administrative body or a judicial authority for GPA parties, and you can have an initial stage that do not comply with the full requirements, but then you need to have a right of appeal, for example. The GPA also seeks to preserve what we would call natural justice procedural rights, for example, the right to be heard, the right to be represented in the proceedings and to have legal counsel. So it's really there in order for a fair and transparent procedure to be in place. Yeah, and again, corrective action or rapid interim measures need to be there. Now, let's see what can be challenged in these kind of procedures, and there the GPA really doesn't limit what can be challenged. So any step in the procurement process can be subject to this challenge, and this is important for you because any step in the procedure can potentially create problems and you may want to enforce your rights. So for example, if there's no adequate notice that this procurement is happening, this is something that can be challenged. Or if the solicitation is restrictive. For example, the technical requirements, the technical specifications are too restrictive. That can be challenged. If there's technical specifications that favor a particular supplier, I was talking about this need to have or equivalent, for example, in the technical specifications. If that's not complied with, you can complain against it. If you feel you're being excluded from competition arbitrarily, and you had the right to participate in this tender, but you weren't provided with that right, you can complain against it. And I think Israel gave an example of them working with a supplier where the supplier had made a bad experience and then they were able to resolve this. So these things do happen, and it's important to be able to correct them. Then, for example, the award criteria could have been applied in an incorrect manner. This is something you can complain against. Or, let's be honest, a lot of countries face problems with corruption in the procurement process. So if this kind of thing happens, this is also something that needs to come up and that needs to be able to address. So here again, the domestic review system is important, and it's important that you enforce your rights under the GPA to ensure that integrity can prevail. And really, this is something where problems exist in any procurement system. This is not something that's a problem of transition economies or developing economies. We have cases everywhere, unfortunately. So again, it's important that you enforce your rights in order for the system to work properly. So that already brings me to the end of my presentation, and I know that I stand between you and your lunch, so I don't want to keep you too long. Really, the message here is that the GPA sees a domestic review system and the launching of domestic review procedures as something that's positive because it helps clean up the process. It's good for you because you can enforce your rights, and it's good for the procuring authorities, for the state, for the public, because it helps clean up the process and identify problems with it. And again, I was impressed with Georgia being so upfront about this. We like the number going up because this helps us improve our system and it shows trust in our domestic review system. The GPA, again, does not impose one particular form of domestic review in all GPA parties, and we see a lot of variety of different types of bodies, but it makes sure that there is something you can do if your rights are violated. And the WTO dispute settlement understanding then still remains available as a second layer. And this is where communication between you and the authorities here in Ukraine comes in and is very important again, because if you feel that your rights cannot be ensured through the domestic review system, if there's a bigger problem or the domestic review procedure then results in the correction of a potential error, then you're free to contact your government and they can help you enforce your rights also in the WTO dispute settlement system. Thank you.